At 4:12 past midnight, near the Dzhankoy rail junction in northern Crimea, a 6,000-ton fuel transport is cutting across the flat black landscape at exactly 50 miles per hour. 62 tank cars, each filled to the brim with high-octane aviation fuel, are moving toward the air bases that keep the southern front alive. Inside the locomotive, the Russian crew is calm, sipping tea and listening to the steady rhythm of steel on steel. Above them, the sky is protected by a layered shield of S-400 and Pantsir-S1 batteries, their radar dishes sweeping the horizon with cold mechanical certainty. To Russian commanders, this train is traveling through an invisible fortress, a corridor of electronic safety no drone or missile should ever penetrate. They have run this route 47 times in the last 2 months without a single incident. That streak of success has created something far more dangerous than confidence. It has created complacency. The roar of the engine has drowned out the truth of a changing battlefield. They believe their air defenses are a wall, but every wall has a crack, and sometimes that crack is only a few inches wide. Before we go further, hit like and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you know. Exactly 180 seconds from now, that 6,000-ton symbol of Russian logistics will become a 2,000-foot pillar of fire. The plan to destroy it did not begin in a laboratory or inside a high-tech weapons factory. It began on a digital map in a basement in Mykolaiv. Ukrainian planners were not simply trying to blow up a train. They were solving a high-speed geometry problem. A target moving at 50 miles per hour is a nightmare for traditional drone operators, because a delay of even 1 second in communication means a miss of more than 70 feet. This mission demanded a level of precision that ignored the normal rules of engagement. They did not need a stealth bomber. They did not need a $1 million cruise missile. What they needed were 12 plywood drones, each costing less than a used sedan, and a team of pilots who understood the physics of momentum better than the Russians understood the limits of their own radar. The hook was already set, and the Russian crew aboard that train was unknowingly pulling the line tighter with every mile toward the interception point. The drones, designated the Morok-series, were deliberately built to look like junk to a sophisticated radar system. Constructed from carbon fiber and high-density foam, they carried a radar cross-section no larger than a common seagull. They were not fitted with expensive anti-jamming packages or complex satellite uplinks. Instead, they relied on a principle as old as war itself: terrain masking. As the swarm crossed the front line, the 12 drones dropped to just 15 feet above the ground, hugging the contours of a shallow limestone valley that cut through the Crimean steppe. By staying below the hills, they stayed below the radar's line of sight. To an S-400 operator sitting 10 miles away, the horizon looked completely clean. This was the first fast win for the Ukrainian side. They used the Earth itself as a shield, bypassing a billion-dollar sensor network without firing a single shot. The threat was already inside the inner perimeter, and the Russian defense was still staring at the clouds, waiting for a ghost that was never coming. Radar systems are exceptional at tracking fast-moving jets at 30,000 feet, but they are surprisingly poor at detecting a slow-moving piece of foam at 15 feet. The reason is a core software limitation known as ground clutter filtering. To keep radar screens from being flooded with false returns from trees, buildings, and moving vehicles, the system is programmed to ignore objects traveling below certain speed and altitude thresholds. The Morok drones were flying at exactly 95 miles per hour, right on the edge of that filter. They were effectively impersonating the background noise of the world. Inside the Russian command center, a junior radar technician caught a flicker on his display, a weak, ambiguous pulse that disappeared as quickly as it arrived. He hesitated. Reporting a false alarm could bring punishment for wasting the commander's time. Ignoring it meant trusting the machine. He chose to wait for confirmation. That 10-second pause became the second major victory of the operation. The gap opened and the drones were through. At exactly 4:22 a.m. TAV, the Russian electronic warfare complex known as the Krasuka-4 unleashed its invisible scream across the electromagnetic spectrum. The system was designed to blanket a 60-mile radius in white noise and sever the connection between drones and their pilots. For most unmanned aircraft, that is a death sentence. They either hover uselessly until fuel runs out or tumble into a spin. But Ukrainian engineers had anticipated this brute force jamming and equipped every Morok drone with a secondary inertial navigation system. Using internal gyroscopes and accelerometers, the drones could calculate their position from the last known coordinates before signal loss. So while Russian operators watched their jamming meters climb to 100% and assumed the sky had been cleared, the 12 drones were silently following a pre-programmed route without requiring a single byte of outside data. This was the third fast win. Human control had given way to autonomous persistence. The drones were no longer being steered. They had become high-speed arrows flying toward a target still moving at 50 miles per hour, and now only 4 miles away. Navigational drift is the silent enemy of every inertial system. By the time the swarm reached the final 3-mile approach, accumulated error had grown to nearly 50 feet. For the Russian defenders, this was the ideal moment to spoof them, feeding fake GPS signals into the air and trying to convince the drones they were actually 10 miles off course. But the onboard algorithms had been designed to detect impossible data patterns, sudden jumps in altitude, impossible velocity spikes, readings that exceeded what the airframe could physically do. Instead of accepting the false signal, the drones shifted into their terminal mode, thermal targeting. The 6,000-ton fuel train was not just metal on rails. It was a gigantic heat source. The 62 tank cars, the friction of wheels against steel, and the locomotive's roaring diesel engines all glowed against the freezing Crimean ground like a flare in a dark room. The pilots recovered visual contact through a hardened burst link frequency that pulsed for only milliseconds at a time, short enough to evade detection. They did not need a constant video stream. They only needed to see the heat of the target once every 5 seconds to refine the final approach. Then came the critical strategic decision. The train entered a stretch of track surrounded by open fields, far from any residential zone. The Ukrainian command team had 2 options. They could wait for the train to stop at the Dzhankoy station where it would become a sitting target, or strike it now while it was still moving at 50 miles per hour. A stationary strike is easier. A moving strike is catastrophic. If the locomotive is disabled at high speed, the 62 fuel cars behind it do not simply stop. They telescope into one another, multiplying structural failure and guaranteeing total loss of the cargo. The order was given to engage the moving target. That decision increased the mission's difficulty tenfold, because the drones now had to solve a lead pursuit intercept under communication latency. The split-second delay between the drone seeing the train and the pilot transmitting a correction meant they had to aim not where the train was, but where it would be 3 seconds later. The mission had become a live physics equation, with gravity, wind, and momentum as the only variables that mattered. The Russian Pantsir point defense system on a nearby ridge finally reacted as the drones crested the final hill. It was a mechanical beast, capable of spitting out 5,000 rounds per minute from twin 30mm cannons. But the Pantsir had been designed to kill cruise missiles and high-flying aircraft, not ground-skimming drones. Its mechanical depression limits made it difficult to angle the guns low enough to hit targets flying just above the surface. As the drones came in from multiple directions, the automated turret locked onto the nearest contact. The Russian gunner opened fire. But the extreme rate of fire caused localized overheating in the cooling jackets after only 4 seconds of sustained engagement. The system entered a temporary safety shutdown to keep the barrels from warping. During that 4-second gap, 2 drones were shredded. The remaining 10 split into 3 separate attack vectors and rushed through the opening. This was the 5th fast win. The defenders had overcommitted, and their own safety protocols had momentarily blinded them. The corridor to the 6,000-ton prize was now completely exposed. At 4:26 a.m., the 10th Morok drone slammed into the lead locomotive's secondary air intake at exactly 42 miles per hour. Its 66-pound-shaped charge did not simply detonate. It drove a 30,000-degree plasma jet straight through the engine block, severing the fuel lines and instantly freezing the massive pistons. The 6,000-ton train did not stop all at once, but the sudden loss of traction sent a violent kinetic shudder through the remaining 61 tank cars. Inside the cab, the Russian engineers had less than 3 seconds to react before the next drone struck the coupling between the second and third cars. This was not random. It was a deliberate structural hit meant to snap the train's spine while it was still carrying full momentum. When the coupling shattered, the hydraulic brake lines tore apart and triggered an emergency lockup along the full length of the transport. That was the moment when physics took command and technology became irrelevant. The sudden deceleration drove the rear cars forward into the front, in a process known as telescoping. The sheer mass of the aviation fuel turned the train into its own hammer, crushing steel tanks into one another like empty cans. The rupture of the first 5 tank cars released nearly 80,000 gallons of high-octane fuel into the air as a pressurized mist. When the third and fourth drones struck inside that cloud, the result was not an ordinary fire. It was a thermobaric event. A giant orange fireball expanded at 2,000 feet per second, consuming the oxygen around it and creating a vacuum that pulled the remaining cars inward toward the center of the inferno. The heat grew so intense that the rails beneath the train began to lose structural integrity, softening into plastic deformation. That meant even if the fire could somehow be extinguished, the route itself had already been destroyed. At that point, the human element of the Russian defense collapsed completely. Ground troops were seen abandoning vehicles and sprinting into the dark fields, terrified of the next chain of explosions. That psychological victory rarely gets the attention it deserves in tactical briefings, but it is often the most enduring result of a precision strike. The illusion of safety had been replaced by a reality of total vulnerability. The most advanced air defense systems in the world had failed to stop plywood and foam from erasing a billion-ruble transport. One final drone, damaged during the initial breach by a 30mm shell, was still airborne. Its left stabilizing fin had been torn away, and its motor was vibrating at a frequency that suggested total failure was only moments away. In a normal operation, that drone would have been written off. But the Ukrainian pilot used what remained of its momentum to steer it into the final cluster of fuel cars at the rear of the train. It did not need a healthy engine. It did not need a clean signal. It only needed to fall with purpose. When it struck the 60-second car, the last explosion completed the circle of destruction. The entire 6,000-ton transport became one unbroken line of fire stretching more than half a mile. That final payoff was the ultimate proof of swarm redundancy. By the time the sun began to rise over the Crimean steppe, all that remained of Russia's strategic fuel supply was a scorched wound in the earth and a mangled maze of blackened steel that would take months to clear. The strategic consequences of the Dzhankoy strike reached the Kremlin within the hour, triggering a wave of internal investigations into the failure of the S-400 network. The official report would eventually blame a software glitch, but the truth was much more humiliating for the Russian high command. They had been beaten by low-cost technology and higher-level physics. Ukrainian planners had turned the complexity of Russian systems against them, exploiting their filters, their safety mechanisms, and their rigid chains of command. Every layer of Russian defense had been built to counter a conventional threat. But when confronted by an adaptive multi-vector swarm, the entire architecture became a liability. That asymmetry defines modern warfare. The cost of defending a target is now often 100 times greater than the cost of destroying it. The 6,000-ton train was gone, but the lesson it left behind was even more destructive. In an era of persistent surveillance and precision drones, there is no such thing as a secure rear area. As the fire kept burning, the effect on the air bases of southern Crimea was immediate. Without the high-octane aviation fuel carried by that train, the sortie rate of Russian fighter regiments dropped by 40% within the first 24 hours. That created an air vacuum over the front, giving Ukrainian ground forces a level of freedom they had not seen in weeks. The strike was not just a logistical success, it was an operational enabler that changed the geometry of the entire theater. Russian commanders were forced to pull dozens of air defense units away from the front to protect other rail junctions, thinning the very sectors where those systems were needed most. And from that moment forward, every time a Russian officer stared at a radar screen and saw a faint flicker, he had to wonder whether it was a bird, a vehicle, or the opening move of the next $60 million disaster. That uncertainty is a weapon that never runs out of ammunition. The timing of the attack may have been the most impressive part of the entire operation. The train was hit exactly 3 minutes after passing the last major hardened bunker and 2 minutes before entering the heavily fortified Dzhankoy rail yards. Ukrainian planners had identified a 5-mile dead zone where the terrain favored the attacker and defensive response time was at its weakest. That level of predictive intelligence suggests they were not merely observing the train. They were simulating the full Russian response in real time. They knew when the Pantsir barrels would overheat, they knew when the radar operator would hesitate, and they knew exactly how much momentum the train would need to destroy itself once struck. This was the 7th and final fast win, the realization that the target's own speed and weight were the primary explosives in its destruction. The drones were only the catalyst for a disaster Russia had unknowingly prepared for over months of routine movement. In the aftermath, the Dzhankoy rail line fell cold and silent. Satellite imagery showed the heat had warped the ground so severely that the entire section of track would need to be excavated and rebuilt from the foundation upward. That meant the primary artery carrying Russian supplies into northern Crimea had been cut for the foreseeable future. The drones had not merely destroyed a train, they had redrawn the logistics map of the region. The cost of the 12 drones used in the attack was less than $50,000. The combined value of the fuel, the locomotives, the rail cars, and the infrastructure damage exceeded $85 million. That ratio of destruction is exactly why the drone swarm has become one of the most serious threats to conventional military power in the 21st century. It shatters the economy of scale on which large militaries depend, allowing a smaller and more agile force to inflict strategic-level damage for the price of a handful of consumer-grade electronics. and the final payload of the mission was not delivered by a drone at all. It was delivered by the footage. High-definition thermal video of the 6,000-ton train exploding at 50 miles per hour was leaked to social media within hours, bypassing Russian state media's efforts to minimize the incident. That visual proof became a devastating counter-narrative to the myth of impenetrable air defenses. It chipped away at public confidence and hit the morale of Russian logistics troops even harder. When the men who operate these trains watch others like them vanish into a fireball in seconds, their willingness to take risks starts to disappear. The mission was a complete success, proving that no matter how much armor or electronic protection surrounds a target, the laws of physics and the ingenuity of a determined attacker will always find a path through. The 6,000-ton train was gone in 3 minutes, but the echoes of its destruction would continue to roll across the entire front long after the flames died.